The gavel cracked against the hardwood, a sound sharp enough to make the fluorescent lights in the courtroom seem to flicker. The air was heavy with murmurs, whispers rolling like a restless tide through the gallery as all eyes turned toward the bench. Judge Andrew Napolitano leaned forward, his silver hair gleaming under the glow, his jaw clenched in a mixture of authority and irritation. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, "I am fining you $5,000 for contempt of court." The Jasmine Crockett's lips tightened, though her eyes, dark, intelligent, unwavering, held their fire. For a moment, she didn't move. Her silk blazer caught the light as she slowly rose from her chair, every motion measured, as though she were gathering not just her papers but the weight of her ancestors, her dreams, her fury, and her purpose. The silence thickened. One could hear the shuffle of a bailiff's boots, the faint scratching of a journalist's pen, and the pounding of hearts waiting to see whether she would swallow the insult or fight back. She chose to fight. To understand why Jasmine stood the way she did, one must know where she came from. Born in Dallas to a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked 2 jobs. Mechanic by day, security guard by night. She grew up watching her parents carry themselves with dignity even when the world handed them scraps. She was taught early that silence could be mistaken for acceptance, and that speaking truth, though dangerous, was the only way to bend the arc of justice closer to fairness. Law had called to her, not as a profession, but as a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a song. Judge Napolitano, too, was no stranger to history's weight. A man shaped by years on the bench, by a career threaded with both reverence and controversy, he had grown accustomed to wielding authority like a sword. He believed in law as order, in discipline as virtue, and in punishment as correction. But beneath that hardened philosophy was a man wary of the shifting tides of politics, a man who often felt that young firebrands like Jasmine threatened not the law, but his very identity as its guardian. The fine was more than a financial penalty, it was a warning, a declaration that this was his court, his kingdom. But Jasmine Crockett was not the type to kneel in another man's kingdom. She gathered her papers, stepped forward, and spoke with a voice that carried to the farthest corners of the chamber. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this fine doesn't diminish me. It diminishes you. It is not justice you seek, it is obedience. And if that is the standard, then history itself stands in contempt." The gallery erupted, some gasping, some clapping before being silenced by the bailiff's booming order. Judge Napolitano's eyes narrowed, but something in his chest tightened, not with anger alone, but with the uncomfortable pang of realization. She was not just speaking to him. She was speaking to the air, to the walls, to every reporter scribbling notes, to every citizen who would read the headlines by dawn. Subplots began to weave themselves through the tension of that moment. Outside the courtroom, Jasmine had been fighting a quieter battle, her own doubts. Nights alone in her apartment often found her staring at old family photos, asking herself if her fight was worth the toll it took on her health, her relationships, her peace. Her closest friend, Denise, had warned her weeks earlier, "Jazz, these men aren't just going to push back. They'll try to break you, and I'm scared one day they might succeed." That fear haunted her more than she admitted. At the same time, Judge Napolitano carried a private burden of his own. His estranged daughter, Sophia, hadn't spoken to him in years, blaming his rigid worldview for the collapse of their bond. She was an activist, too, though on the opposite end of his beliefs. Watching Jasmine that day, young, fearless, unyielding, brought back shades of his daughter's voice, her arguments, her passion. And though he tried to silence the memory, it clawed its way into his conscience, whispering she could be Sophia. The case itself was not the point. The fine was not the point. The true clash was deeper, an old guard clinging to control and a rising generation demanding to be heard. Each word Jasmine spoke seemed to peel away layers of pretense in the courtroom. "My parents taught me," she said, her tone softer now but no less powerful, "that respect is earned, not demanded. You fine me today, but tomorrow children in classrooms will read about leaders who stood when others bowed. And that is a debt no gavel can collect." The turning point came when silence fell again. Judge Napolitano stared at her, his hand hovering above his papers, the weight of authority suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. He could double the fine. He could hold her in contempt and order her removed. Yet something inside him resisted. For the first time in decades, he questioned whether crushing her spirit would uphold the dignity of the court, or expose its fragility. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, crowds had begun to gather. Word spread quickly in the age of instant news. Students, activists, ordinary citizens, they arrived with handmade signs, chanting her name, demanding fairness. Jasmine's internal conflict, the tug between exhaustion and perseverance, collided with the external momentum of a movement that seemed to lift her above her own fears. The climax came when Judge Napolitano finally spoke, his voice less steady than before. Representative Crockett, though you have tested the boundaries of this court, perhaps the boundaries themselves must be examined. It was not an apology, but it was a crack in the wall. And Jasmine, sensing the shift, delivered her final blow not with anger, but with grace. The law is strong, Your Honor. Strong enough to survive questions. Strong enough to bend toward justice. Don't fear those who challenge it. Fear those who stay silent while it fails. The room hung suspended, and in that fragile stillness, something undeniable took root, not just in the judge's mind, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The resolution came days later. Though the fine technically stood, the headlines told a different story. Jasmine Crockett defies court, inspires movement. Judge Napolitano, alone in his chambers, stared at a photo of Sophia and for the first time in years dialed her number. Jasmine, returning home to Denise, confessed through tears that she had been terrified, but that terror had been necessary fuel. Courage, she whispered, who'sn't the absence of fear? It's standing tall while your knees shake. The lesson lingered like an echo that true power is not in silencing opposition, but in listening to it, that dignity is not enforced through fines, but earned through fairness, and that the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be so easily subdued. And so, though Judge Napolitano fined Jasmine Crockett, it was he who carried the heavier burden afterward, the burden of regret, reflection, and the chance for redemption. Jasmine walked away not richer in money, but in purpose, her voice amplified, her resolve unshaken. For those who heard the story, whether in the courtroom or across the airwaves, it became more than a clash between two figures. It was a reminder that history often pivots on moments where one person dares to rise, to speak, to refuse the silence. And in that defiance, hope is born.